So then without further ado, I'm going to move over to our first panel discussion. You don't need to go anywhere. As if by magic, the feed will switch over to our panel, and we're going to be discussing how customers are finding gambling block loopholes and how the sector can respond. And it will be chaired by the Head of External Affairs at Money and Mental Health, Brian Semple. So over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Semple. I'm Head of External Affairs at the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute. And welcome to our first panel of the day, where we're going to be talking about gambling blocks, the ban on credit card gambling, and more particularly, some of the ways that people are using loopholes and workarounds to get around those blocks and bans, and also thinking a bit about what the response can be from financial services as well as government and regulators. So obviously in recent years, we've seen great progress in terms of more and more banks offering gambling blocks to help customers manage their spending. So we think in the past 3 years, since starting on Monzo first introduced gambling blocks, we estimate now that around 90% of current accounts now offer a gambling block, which is huge progress. Many of them crucially include friction, such as a cooling off period to help people stay in control. And we know that from research by the Personal Finance Research Centre that this is having a big impact. Alongside that, in 2020, as we heard earlier from Minister Philp, the Gambling Commission introduced the ban on credit card gambling, and obviously today has published its interim evaluation of that impact. I haven't unfortunately seen much of that in detail, but from what I hear of the headlines, it obviously suggests that the ban on gambling credit cards has been is working well. It's having a positive impact, and it's making a big difference in terms of offering that kind of barrier for people who may be at risk of gambling harm. So that all adds up to real progress. But clearly, it's not a job of case done in terms of thinking about the gambling ban on credit cards and also gambling blocks. So, one of the things highlighted in the Gambling Commission report this morning is that there is quite strong awareness among people who are gambling of workarounds to the ban, and that's something we've also become aware of in terms of the different spending blocks that banks are offering. Whenever we've been talking to people who've lived experience of gambling issues, many do say that they're finding different ways to get around blocks and the credit card ban, from everything from using international gambling sites to e-wallets and faster payment services. And so in this session, we're going to focus on these loopholes and workarounds. We're going to spend a bit of time thinking about what it's like for people who are trying to use the blocks and maybe thinking about using workarounds, what kinds of things they might be experiencing in that kind of process. And we're also going to be thinking about what financial services, regulators and government can do to try and close those loopholes. And I'm delighted to say we've got a really good panel to discuss these questions. First of all, I'm really pleased to introduce Michael, who is going to talk about his personal story of gambling addiction and his experience of using some of the tools and safeguards that we are discussing today. Michael has experienced problem gambling for many years, and following support from the National Problem Gambling Clinic, is passionate about supporting others to overcome addiction. He has recent first-hand knowledge of some of the safeguards put in by financial institutions to protect people, and wants to use his experiences of these to promote further change that could help others. It's the first time that Michael has shared his story publicly, so we're really grateful for you doing so today, Michael, and joining us. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Brian. What an introduction. So yes, this is the first time I've told my story, and I hope you find it useful in terms of the session today. So everyone always has their views of a stereotypical gambler, someone who maybe is an older man, maybe unemployed, scraping the pennies together to bet on the dogs and things like that. I'm here to prove that that's not quite true. I never gambled until my mid-20s. I never thought about it. I've got a good education, went to one of the best universities in the world, and have had a very good career, which, financially should mean that I'm very, very stable. Unfortunately, 2 years ago, I was in a very low situation. I'd lost all my money. I'd maxed out all my credit cards, payday loans, everything. And I basically had about £10 a month to spend on food. And my lowest point came about 2 years ago when I was scraping together pennies from around my house to be able to buy food to feed me for the week. So that's how low I went, and I know many people from very different backgrounds who have been in that situation as well. I managed to get out of it through the National Problem Gambling Clinic, as Brian said. However, like any addiction, which gambling is, it's something that always sits with you and you always have to be aware of. You're only one step away from another relapse. I worked with somebody in the gambling clinic who didn't gamble for 18 years after a problem and then suddenly went back into it and lost everything again. So it's always something that stays with us. Now, over the last 10 years, I say I've lost everything. However, I'm now at the position where I want to be able to help others to tell their story. And also to open up about this issue. We all know that gambling isn't going to go away. Its prevalence is increasing, and I think the banks are doing a good job in helping people like myself. But as Brian said, people can find workarounds, and unfortunately for people like us with these addictions, we try and find these workarounds more than others. One of the big things you can have is there's a gambling group called GamStop, which I'm part of, which means that I can't do any online gambling. The first thing people do when they sign up to it, and I did it myself, was Google how to work around GamStop. So you try and find ways to avoid it. And that's the case with the banking stuff as well. The banking stuff can help, but there's always going to be people like myself who will try and find workarounds. When Boris announced the lockdown last year, just before Christmas, on the 19th of December, I actually relapsed. I completely lost it and basically took out all the money that I'd saved over the lockdown and spent it all in one day, because I knew that the gambling facilities were closing, that life was going to go back to very dark days, and I relapsed then. I've only relapsed that once. Many other people have done that more often than that. So the blocks that I've used all of the gambling blocks that you can do, casinos, online gambling, and things like that, and the bank tools as well. I think the newer banks coming in, I call them the industry disruptors, like your Monzos and your Starlings, are really good because they introduce the kind of gambling block, so I can just go on the app and block gambling for 72 hours. And if I unlock it, then it takes me 3 days before I can gamble, and that's really good because people like myself will act on impulse. We want to do something immediately. Right now, I don't want to gamble. In an hour's time, I can't promise that I won't want to gamble. I don't know what the day is going to hold. So having that block in place is really good. One of the things that I think is a really big challenge is cash transactions. I think it's really important that that is something that's discussed. So I've been able to take money out on credit cards from bank accounts, and every single bank, and I have a number of bank accounts through legacy and new providers, every time I've contacted them to ask for my limit of cash transactions to be reduced because I don't really need cash anymore, they've all said they were unable to do that. But when I had a gambling problem, I was able to, I had £500 limits on my account. I was able to increase that to £1,000 without any real questions. Why do you need to take out more money? Oh, I've got a holiday I want to pay for. Now, who pays for a holiday with £1,000 of cash? There were no real checks there. With the increase in personal choice about spending money, and your Google Pays and your contactless, things like that, the limit's just gone up to £100. That's really good for most people. For people like me, it's a lot more dangerous. If we're able to make things easier for people to spend money, we should also be able to make it easier for people not to spend that money. If I only want to have a limit of £20 cash to take out, why can't I do that? Why can I increase it but not decrease it from the standard limits? Surely that's very simple. And finally, before I finish, I have managed to work around the gambling tools, particularly around foreign transactions. So when I did have my blip, as I mentioned to you, whilst I had all the blocks in place, and they work very well, by the way, I've never managed to work around the UK-based providers of gambling that everyone knows. But if I wanted, and I did, spend a few £100s on a Turkish company and spend money in Turkish lira, that transaction went through without any problems. Now, all the banks knew of my problem. I'd written letters to them all to tell them about my gambling issue and things like that, so that they were aware of where I was. But transactions like that were easy to go through with absolutely no checks whatsoever. If I try and buy something off Amazon, I often get a notification saying, do you want to make this online transaction? If I wanted to spend money in Turkish lira at a gambling site that probably isn't even authorized in the UK, that wasn't a problem. So I think to close my point, I think the banks are doing a really, really good job, but with increased personal choice, I think we need to look at people being able to restrict their activity as well as being able to make their activity easier. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of panel discussion, however difficult they might be. Please do ask them, because it's important that I speak openly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. And as I said, we really appreciate you, joining us to share your personal experiences. I know it's not an easy thing to do, and to do so powerfully and honestly is really valuable. So thank you so much for joining us for that. Lots there already to discuss whenever we get to the panel part, the discussion part of the panel. So if you do have questions, please do share them in the chat and hop in, and we'll make sure that we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. So if you do have questions, get in early if you can. We'll try and get to your question. Next up, we have Anna Hemmings, who's Chief Executive of the charity GamCare. Anna joined GamCare in 2018 and has wide-ranging experience in working in health and social care with a focus on addictions. And I know Anna has also been part of the work that GamCare have been doing, looking at issues around workarounds and loopholes with a cross-sector kind of group of people and experts that they've been working with. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you. And thanks, Michael, for sharing your story. It really, really brings to life some of the points I was going to make, actually, and does reflect as well lots of the stories that we hear at GamCare. So for those of you that don't know, GamCare are a national charity working to reduce gambling harms. We operate the National Gambling Helpline, and that gets about 42,000 calls last year, certainly. And we operate treatment services around the UK via a network of partners, and we see about 10,000 people a year in those services. And then on top of that, we do lots of work to really raise awareness of gambling harms. So we reached about 15,000 people last year in our outreach and education programmes. But a key thing for us is that in terms of gambling harms, there's three main impacts that gambling has on people's lives. One is on their mental health and well-being. The stress, anxiety, and so on of having a gambling issue can really take its toll on people's lives. And then alongside that, an impact on relationships. But 2/3 or nearly 70% of people that come forward to us have debt or financial problems. So it's a really significant issue in the cohort. So we put together a gambling-related financial harms programme of work where we aim to bring together all the different sectors that are relevant to these issues, so banks and financial institutions, debt agencies, people with lived experience, and gambling operators as well, to really explore financial harms and what can be done to address them. And in March, I think it was earlier this year, we had a workshop specifically on this topic around loopholes and how people are finding and using loopholes to the bank blocks. And I suppose what that really centres on is things that avert the use of merchant category codes, the MCC codes for gambling, because the gambling blocks are mainly using those in order to block the transactions. So it's exactly as Michael was saying, it's things like using international sites, things like using e-wallets. That's a very significant thing we find, so PayPal, and there are others as well. And then also being able to effectively use a BACS transfer or an open banking transaction to transfer money to deposit to gambling operators. But there's all sorts of ways actually that people find to get around things. And as Michael was saying, if you're having a strong urge to gamble, that urge will drive you to really explore in some detail the ways that you can avert some of the blocks. And at the moment, our best advice around this, there is lots of work we can do, and there is great progress that's been made in the last few years. I mean, it's only 3 years since the first bank block was introduced. So, we've come a long way, but there's still lots to be done. And at the moment for consumers, our best advice is to layer up the tools that you use. So firstly, we'd advise talking to someone if you feel that you're concerned about your gambling. So contact the National Gambling Helpline. It runs 24 hours a day. But also use GamStop, as Michael mentioned he's done. So that's a self-exclusion scheme for online gambling. Use products like Gamban, which is a blocking software, and they will prevent access to gambling websites at device level. So you'd put it on your phone, tablets, computers, and so on. And then also use the bank blocks. And the more you layer up these different tools, the more protected you're likely to be. So if you think you can get around GamStop by using a black market site, Gamban should be able to block your access to it. And so it goes on. So by layering up and having a sort of mesh or a net of different support there, that's probably the best protection people can put in place for themselves at the moment. And in the meantime, of course, we all need to come together as the different industries connected to this field and kind of pursue progress, really, in terms of minimising the ways that people can get around these things.
Thanks very much, Anna. Our third panellist is Natalie Ledward, who is Head of Vulnerable Customers at Monzo. Natalie works across vulnerability, accessibility and financial inclusion at Monzo, and she was the winner of the first Which Year Consumer Champion in 2019 award for her work to create a gambling block for customers at risk of gambling harms and other issues. Natalie's going to talk a little bit about today some of the work that Monzo is doing on these issues, and particularly thinking about how we can close down some of the loopholes that people may be using to get around blocks. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, first of all. Hi, everyone. So for anyone who hasn't heard of us, Monzo is a digital-only bank. We live on your smartphone. We were founded in 2015, so we're still relatively new, and we got our banking license in 2017, so that was when we launched our first current account. We are still growing quite fast, though, so we've got 5.6 million customers in the UK. Visibility and control are really at the heart of what we try and do for our customers, and because we're an online-only provider, it's really important that we're developing really market-leading digital tools to support our customers to manage their money online. Our company mission at Monzo, it's quite an ambitious one, but we think it's a good one, is to make money work for everyone. I lead our approach to vulnerability, financial inclusion and accessibility, and this function really is there to ensure that Monzo considers every customer, including anyone who might have additional needs. All of us are going to struggle at some point in our lives with money, and we really want to empower our customers with tools, basically to help no matter what they're struggling with. We were the first bank in the UK to develop and roll out a friction-based gambling block, and this year's review of the Gambling Act is an opportunity for us, we think, to try and level up these solutions. We've already talked about loopholes and how robust these tools are. Earlier this year, we at Monzo pulled together a Gambling Act coalition because we can't do this alone. We think that we should all be working together, which is why I'm here today. And we think there's so much more that we could do. So just a little bit about the gambling block. We launched it in 2018 after our customers asked for one. And when someone spends on their Monzo card, each transaction is tagged with what's called a merchant category code. That information is provided to us by MasterCard, and it tells us what type of transaction the customer has carried out. There's a merchant category code for gambling, and so when someone switches on the gambling block, the transaction will automatically decline. We spoke to experts in gambling addiction when we were developing the gambling block to make sure that it's the most useful tool that it can be. The experts recommended that we build it with an element of friction. So it's really easy to turn on, but to turn it off, customers have to reach out to our customer support and then wait 48 hours to gamble again. We're really lucky to have a dedicated specialist team at Monzo who are trained to navigate these types of conversations with customers. And we think the addition of human intervention is really helpful. So as part of these conversations, our support team will often discuss what additional support the customer may need. We've spoken this morning already about workarounds, and we know that there's plenty, and this isn't just a single solution. Layering up is definitely the way forward. So we'll make sure that we're offering our customers additional account measures, such as reducing their limits on ATM withdrawals, reducing limits on card transactions, bank transfers, but it also might be to make sure the customer knows about blocking software such as Gamban, signposting to external support, and other self-exclusion methods. New innovations in payments have meant building comprehensive payment blockers it's become really difficult, basically. So more people in the UK are making use of new non-card based ways to pay. This was exacerbated by lockdown. So some providers reported an 800% increase in the use of bank transfer based payment methods. And as a result, gambling firms have adapted to start to offer these innovations, with nearly every leading gambling provider in the UK offering a non-card based deposit taking method, according to our research. And these methods offer consumers a really slick, convenient experience straight from their bank account. We're currently in the process of commissioning research to give more detail on the growth of these payment methods, but we're seeing increasingly more complaints. These developments pose a significant problem for gambling blocks in the UK, because every gambling block on the market today can only prevent transfers to gambling sites made via card payment. Gambling firms are slowly becoming aware that new payment types aren't supported. So right now, unlike with card payments, we can't, as a bank, access the data we need to prevent payments being made directly from customers' bank accounts. So earlier this year, we piloted an extension with a specialist payment provider for our customers with the gambling block activated, and we're looking to roll this out to more providers this year. So, unless the gambling industry cooperates and works with us, we are unable at the moment to scale this solution in any meaningful, consistent way for our customers. So as a result, we this year called on the government to mandate the publication of gambling firms' bank account details in a central registry, to promote cooperation with specialist payment firms, and to make sure every customer who wants a block can access one, regardless of how they pay. Thank you. That's where we're up to.
Thanks very much, Natalie. That's really interesting. Lots to get stuck into there, and particularly interested in thinking about the Gambling Act review and what that could mean. I'm sure that's something that we will come to in the discussion. And our final panelist today is Aisling Mcconner from the Behavioural Insights team. Aisling is Head of Consumer and Business Markets there, and she oversees Behavioural Insights team's new Gambling Policy and Research Unit, which is a really exciting development launched recently, as well as overseeing teams focused on digital markets, regulated markets, and business and macroeconomic policy. So Aisling is going to talk a little bit about what we can learn from kind of behavioural economics and behavioural insights in terms of how people are using these tools. So over to you, Aisling.
Great, thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here with you today, and thank you so much to the speakers who have already spoken. I've already learned an incredible amount, I have to say. So I suppose I wanted to start off by acknowledging the importance and value of a systems approach to reducing harm in any context. Harnessing the insights and ability of the financial sector is crucial to reducing gambling harms, and therein lies countless opportunities. Secondly, it was excellent to see the innovative leadership of Monzo in 2018, launching the Gamble Block, and seeing now that, as Brian mentioned earlier, 90% of current accounts now provide some sort of blocking software. That is such a movement, and it's really important to recognise that. The tool itself taps into the challenge that many of us have, that it can be really difficult to resist temptation. For some, this might be checking your Twitter, your WhatsApp, your Instagram. For others, this is placing a bet, and may be far more consequential. With the click of a button, you can commit yourself to not spending money on gambling. And as Michael mentioned earlier, that impulse and that drive is an incredibly powerful one. So really kind of thinking about how you can commit yourself in advance to that. From our analysis, we found in the week before people set Monzo's Gamble Block, the amount people spent on gambling increased roughly threefold. So there seems to be some sort of trigger there that gets people kind of thinking about the gambling block. We also didn't find evidence that people who enabled the block were any more likely to withdraw money from an ATM in the subsequent few weeks, which also is an interesting kind of reflections on thinking about the workarounds. More recently, we've also looked at how people respond to reaching a spending limit at the operator level, so thinking about their gambling accounts, slightly separate from their bank accounts. We asked people, what would you do if you reached your limit? We found that 1 in 2 higher risk gamblers said that they would try to find a way to gamble, compared to 1 in 6 of the broader sample. We then asked them how they might go about this, and most people in that context said that they would open another gambling account, which I do think is worthwhile bearing in mind in kind of the broader context of blocks and friction. So what should the next steps be for the financial sector? So here are 3 recommendations. So 1, guide people to how much they can afford to spend on gambling and speak to them about it. Roughly 1 in 2 people we asked said that banks should be responsible for pre-setting limits for people. 3 in 5 people said that any gambling limit should be based on income, some form of income. There's a gap between what operators and banks know about how much people can afford that must be bridged. Secondly, provide a single customer view for gambling spend. Most people have multiple gambling accounts, make it really difficult to track your spending. Those at higher risk tend to have 4 or 5 accounts on average. And using lessons from open banking to design this functionality for people who gamble could have quite a powerful impact. And thirdly, let people set spending limits that work much like a gambling block. For those who gamble, this may be a far more appropriate tool than completely cutting off spending, completely dependent on personal circumstance, and must be clear on that. For example, a recent experiment that we ran found that providing a default limit with a really simple option to change that limit initially meant that people set lower limits overall and were really positive about the tool. So they're just a couple of recommendations. These are all areas that BIT's newly formed Gambling Policy and Research Unit are keen to explore further. Our mission is to test and scale insights to strengthen safeguarding across the gambling ecosystem. And we'll do this in 3 ways. 1, disseminating what works. 2, evaluating interventions. And 3, designing cutting-edge solutions to reduce harm. We really welcome partnerships from across the gambling ecosystem, particularly where there's an appetite to test what works. So please do get in touch if you're interested in working with us, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all for your opening remarks, and thanks, Aisling, for a really interesting contribution. I'm really pleased to see some questions coming in already from the audience, so I'll go straight to them. I have some questions that I'd be quite keen to pose to the panel too, but please do keep your questions coming in, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So the first question is one for you, Michael. Actually, it's from Tim Hawley, who says, big thank you for stepping up to share your story. He was wondering, what would your views be on a permanent block? So something that would be non-reversible. Would you see this, if a bank was able to offer something like that, would you see that as a positive enhancement? Do you think people would want to use it? And how do you think they might feel about sharing this across operators and banks?
That's a really good question. I personally think that is a good thing. For myself, with the gambling blocks I've got in, not through the banks, so GamStop, you can do up to 5 years at a time, and then you have to contact them to take it off, so it kind of goes indefinitely, is my understanding. So I went for the 5 years, and knowing that I can't use UK-based online gambling means it's kind of gone out of my mind, and if I could do it permanently, I would. I would say that the issue of problem gamblers like myself is much bigger than the gambling industry says it is. It's massive, and people like me will always have this issue and will always be at risk of going back. So whilst there may be some people that will put a permanent block on and then regret it, most people, I would guess, who would put a permanent block on something are doing it because they know they have a serious problem and know they're always going to be at risk of coming back. I would love to have a permanent block on everything that I do that risks me for gambling, and I think a lot of people would be the same. The longer it goes on, the easier it is to not relapse. But if after 5 years of, say, GamStop or a banking block and they say, all right, you're free to gamble now, I think there's a high risk that I'll suddenly get excited and just go nuts and spend loads of money, even though I have gone through treatment and know the risks and know the issues.
Thanks, Michael. That's really interesting. And actually, that leads quite nicely onto another question we've had come through from Caroline Fowler. Caroline was saying that there's amazing work happening with financial institutions, but she raises a concern that if banks and other institutions increase restrictions or offer people greater restrictions on their gambling, that there might be a risk that people will be driven to loan sharks or to find other kinds of ways to gamble. I was wondering, Anna, is that something that you've encountered at all in terms of the people you work with at GamCare? Is that something that you've heard in terms of people putting in restrictions to limit themselves and then having to go to quite dangerous routes to try and get around it? For example, loan sharks?
Yes, it's a really interesting point, actually. I mean, I think it does come back to this point that if you're having an urge to gamble, having put various blocks in place, that can feel quite overwhelming. And people do use quite creative ways to try and get around that. And so, yeah, I mean, yes, we do hear sometimes on our helpline that people are pursuing sort of other gambling-like activities. Fortunately, I mean, we do hear about loan sharks, but not necessarily particularly commonly. But debt comes in so many forms, actually. From borrowing from family and friends to, credit card debt and other more formal types of debt. So certainly, debt and owing money and not having money to pay bills, to buy food. All of those things are very, very common things that we hear on the helpline. But I guess at the same time, I feel that that's not a reason not to ensure that we do have good blocks in place. I think the focus needs to be trying to improve the range of blocks, the effectiveness of the blocks, and certainly in some of our work, we're operating the Talk Ban Stop pilot at the moment, which encourages people to layer tools and support. And one of the things that's coming through in the early evaluation from that is quite similar to a point that Michael was making, that by taking that step to put all of these blocks in place, people feel that they've committed to gambling less or to stopping gambling altogether. And that's a helpful thing in itself. Just to know that access is blocked at a number of different levels can really help people's focus move away from that, I think, and reduce the urge to gamble. So I think, there are some risks, of course, but it's really important that we continue this work.
Thank you. And Aisling, do you want to come in on that point? Is there anything that we could maybe learn in terms of what happens from a behavioural insight perspective? What happens if people put the blocks in place and then they are looking to find other ways and potentially going down other risky routes? Have you got any insight in terms of how much people, or what's going on when people are doing that, and what might help people avoid going down those other more risky routes?
That's a great and also a really tough question, Brian. So I suppose the first reflection is friction is surprisingly powerful. So making something a little bit harder can have disproportionate impact on whether people do something or not. Things like default settings, things like a delay to turning something off, etc. I think there's some interesting things. So definitely, so I suppose a few things to think about here. It's like, one, it's how can you get people when they're not in that very focused and tunnel vision space where they are really compelled and feeling an impulse. So how can you get them to kind of commit to a plan in advance? I think that's one thing to consider, and help them kind of really kind of visualize what that means to them to stick to that plan, I would say. I think otherwise, I suppose it's worth actually just exploring kind of the practicalities of what the loopholes people are finding, and exploring whether there are other ways to induce that friction, or have those safeguards in place. So yeah, that's some initial reflections.
Thank you very much. We've had another really interesting question coming from Tony Kelly. And Tony has asked, can the panel explain why the onus is on the consumer to put blocks in place instead of banks intervening when they see numerous gambling transactions come from a consumer? He says there might be a simple answer, but it'd be useful for some clarification in that, in terms of why not offer a phone call or an email to customer who. Sorry, I'm just trying to read this. Email from customer interaction from the bank, or blocking your card for a period of time. So, could there be more that the banks would do in a kind of more proactively interventionist way that takes the onus away from consumers who are struggling with various different challenges? Natalie, would you like to comment on that one?
Yeah, of course. I think this is a really interesting question, and it's something that we've been speaking about for quite a while at Monzo now. Proactive intervention is something that's quite a hot topic, I suppose, in the industry, and I know that some other banks have trialed this successfully, and it's something that we'd very much like to do. We have always focused at Monzo on self-serve options and tools for our customers, and we've really tried to focus on building trust with our customers to make sure that customers feel comfortable to disclose to us. So we have a tool inside our app. If you search, not just about gambling addiction or any other addiction, if you search anything that kind of is a life event or a difficulty in the help section of Monzo, it takes you through to something called Share With Us. And we think, whilst that there's lots of value in obviously having customers let us know their circumstances, because people have different needs, people want different kind of account measures, there is definitely value in looking at proactive intervention. It's just something that we at Monzo want to be really mindful of and careful about, so we haven't got to it yet, but I think it's definitely the next thing for us, something that we'd like to look at.
Thanks, Natalie. Ashton, did you want to comment on that one as well?
Yeah, and I think this links really nicely to kind of the point I was making a moment ago, is that people really need to be motivated to set a block to change their behavior, and that can be really difficult. And there definitely needs to be an onus on banks and operators to make sure that they're upholding their duty of care to the people that they serve. So I think thinking about how you can interact in a more informal way with their customers, so that they can have these conversations. So things like, we're very familiar with kind of notifications around potentially fraudulent transactions on account. What can a similar conversation look like for gambling transactions that seem to be risky? And as I mentioned before, I think there's also a really clear opportunity here for personalization based on customer data, as well as default options that give people choice, but provide them with some form of default setting to minimize any risk and minimize any harm. So yeah, I think they speak to those points.
Thanks very much, Alison. Loads of really great questions coming in, so we're going to try and get through as many as we can here. Next question is from Joe Greavy, and this is one that is directed at Michael. Joe says, thanks again for sharing your story, Michael. And she was wondering, whenever you wrote to banks to advise them of your problems, what was the kind of response that you had? Were there any really standout responses, anything that you found genuinely helpful at that point? Did anyone, any bank make a follow-up call or respond via correspondence to signposting or anything else like that might be able to help with support?
I'm really pleased you asked this question after the last one, because I think it fits in really nicely. The answer is yes. So the issue is the disconnect between banks, which are so big, and I get that you've got lots of different departments. So I'm under with all the banks and all the credit companies that I've gotten loans and all that, I'm under their, what most of them call, specialist services team, and they are amazing. So when I wrote to them, all my interest and stuff was blocked, and I've got a payment plan that works for me. It will take me many years to pay off, but they're all very understanding. They'll never sell on my debt anymore and things like that. And also, if I do have an issue, I'm unable to pay 1 month, there's not going to be all these aggressive letters and things like that. I think the difficulty is, so that's brilliant, that's been really, really good, but that's a separate team from other sections of the bank, and that's where the disconnect lies. So one of the banks that a very well-known bank that I have a significant amount of debt with, I was getting the harassing letters from them about not paying off the money I owed them and things like that. Yet they would also been able to see that my transactions at the time I didn't have GamStop in place were all like gambling based stuff. I was getting paid at the start of the month, and the next day I had zero money in that account, and it was all online gambling. They never once made that link between it. So I was getting the aggressive letters and things like that, and it was only when I wrote to them with a kind of letter about opening up all my mental health struggles and my gambling struggles, things like that, that I got moved to specialist services and things like that. But still, if I wanted to, if I didn't have the GamStops in place and the other bits, I would still be able to use that bank for gambling transactions and things like that. So notwithstanding the 3-day calling off periods and stuff that you can do through the app. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect that my retail banking side of that bank, for example, considers me a normal customer and would allow me to do anything I want, and still refuses to allow me to lower my ATM limits, which I keep asking to do, and things like that. Yet I'm part of their specialist services team who I owe thousands of pounds to, and it would be in their interest for me to be on the straight and narrow because I'll be able to pay them back the money I owe them quicker. And so services are great, but there is a disconnect between different departments within some of the bigger banks from my experience, and that's something that surely can be addressed, especially as I moved house recently, and one of the banks also is linked to another bank, and they said, oh, we can change all your details on all your bank accounts across our portfolio. So if they can change my address, they can obviously understand my transaction history and the issues that I have, and maybe the reason why I got in so much debt without me having to open up and then end up in a specialist team, which is great, but doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Thanks, Michael. Anna, if I could bring you in, I had a question around e-wallets and electric money institutions. We know that that's one of the ways that people are, trying to, one of the means that people are using to try and get around the ban and blocks on gambling. As things stand, as far as I know, no electronic money institutions offer gambling blocks. What do you think is needed to change that? Or do you think we need more regulatory action or political pressure to try and get that part of the sector to be a bit more proactive?
I mean, I'd certainly really like to see that part of the sector being more proactive, because it would be, huge progress if they were, and if blocks were available via those payment methods as well. And actually, in a wider sense, people are using those payment methods more and more in life generally. So I do think that they need to be looking at the same considerations as banks are. So I think that would be a really big step forward, and it would close a very accessible way around things. So yeah, definitely, I'd really like to see that. Another observation I'd make, I guess, is that lots of people will frame or present what is actually a gambling problem as a finance problem, a debt, a money problem first and foremost. So I think banks have got such a key role in raising that conversation. People are still reluctant to talk about gambling. It's not a very well recognised issue, and we need to encourage the conversation so much more. And I think banks have really got a unique opportunity to have that conversation starter with people who may not yet have really admitted to themselves that it's gambling that's driving financial problems. So I think that's a really important consideration in all this. I suppose it's more relevant to the previous question, but I think it's one that's worth kind of throwing into the mix.
Yeah, it's really interesting how it's making that more joint up support and thinking, gambling blocks in and of themselves not being the silver bullet. Is how you make sure that support in different ways and different signpostings all joint up. It's really interesting. We've got a question here from James Grimes, which probably speaks a little bit to some of the things, Natalie, you mentioned in your opening remarks. Why isn't there a greater focus on limiting the number of payment methods that gambling operators can accept? For example, debit card only. Does anyone want to comment on that question? So I think it's, why is there a greater focus, or what do we need to kind of push things on in that way, I guess?
I can start, and if anyone wants to jump in. So I think it's only fair to say that gambling operators are moving with payment innovations, just like any other merchant, to create, what they're seeing as a positive, smooth, customer experience. And I think we in financial services have a real responsibility to keep on top of that. And it's something that we've been very mindful of this year at Monzo to try and make our block the most robust block it can be. And we know that it isn't right now. So I mentioned in my opening remarks earlier this year, we ran a pilot with TrueLayer to basically create an open banking extension to our block. So anybody that's paying through TrueLayer and depositing through that method to a gambling operator, our block wasn't working. Customers don't see the difference between a kind of bank transfer deposit and a card payment deposit. Understandably, it isn't clear in the payment flow, I don't think. And so when they were paying with their Monzo card, the payment was going through, and then they were coming to us and saying, hang on a minute, I've got the gambling block on. How did this happen? So, we trialed this extension to see if it is possible to extend that level of protection for our customers. And it's worked really well, but we were only working with one provider at the moment, TrueLayer. So it's not a perfect solution. It's not 100%. It only works with transfers that are processed by providers that have integrated with us already, which is at the moment one. And it doesn't cover non-open banking initiated bank transfers. So two things that we've been kind of calling out for this year. The first one I already mentioned, we're about to extend and roll this out, this kind of extension out to other providers. So we'll have more coverage there. But we really, really want gambling firms to disclose their bank account details to us, not just to us in a central registry so that any bank can access it. And if any bank wants to make their block a little bit more robust by adding those bank details, it would empower banks and other providers to extend their gambling blocks for a little bit more protection. So I think financial services have a huge role to play, and I think there's a lot we can do.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm aware we've just got a couple of minutes left. So a couple of questions that I'm going to try and merge into one from Amy Taylor and Darren Tong. Amy Taylor raises the point that obviously gambling online is very, very easy. So should there be affordability checks carried out when someone tries to open a gambling account? And Darren raises an initiative that's happening in Canada where there's a low limit guidance suggesting people spend no more than 1% of gross income on gambling. But we know lots of people are more at risk of spending that. Do we think there would be an appropriate limit there? And do we think that affordability checks from banks is something that should be pursued or could be pursued? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to answer.
So happy to initially jump in here. So I suppose to come back to some research that we've done recently, most people, so over 3 in 5 people mentioned to us when we asked them who should be, or if there were preset limits, what should it be based on? People said it should be on income. So 3 in 5 people said some sort of limit should be based on income. So there does seem to be support for that. The appropriate limit is a question. I don't necessarily have an answer to it. I do think that there's a few things to bear in mind. So one is the suggestion that Darren makes around kind of setting a low limit but letting people adjust. I think that's quite an interesting one to explore, and is absolutely ripe for testing. I think there's also a point there about what that percentage looks like, and the fact that there still remains 11 million people in the UK that don't have more than £100 in savings. So that 1% might be too much. So I suppose there's just a question there about that. But in short, there definitely is a need to bridge that gap between what the bank knows and what operators know about how much people can afford.
Thanks, Aisling. Does anyone want to come in very, very quickly on that point? We're just about out of time.
I mean, yeah, I can, just to add, really, I completely support that point. I think affordability is a really important consideration, but it brings to mind single customer view again. And for the people that contact us, they'll often have numerous gambling accounts. They'll often gamble both online and in land-based settings. And they may also have a number of bank accounts. So, single customer view would enable us to really have the global view of where people are gambling, how much they're gambling, how much they're spending, and that would make it considerably easier to understand and implement affordability-based measures.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you very much to all our panelists. Unfortunately, we are out of time now, and thank you everyone who posed questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to absolutely all of them, but there's some really interesting questions that come in there. And thank you for everyone for really interesting comments and remarks. I thought it was a really useful discussion. We are now going to take a 10-minute break before going into breakout sessions, which you can see on the left-hand side of the Hopin platform. So, yeah, we hope you join us again at about 11:10. Thank you very much again to all our panelists.